Useless. Absolutely useless.
As the discussion around businessman Kessie Nair's racist outburst heats up, 3 experts weigh in on how the media reports on issues surrounding mental illness. Also, an award-winning virtual reality concept that's helping industrial workers overcome their fear of heights. And content creation takes to the skies as a prominent airline ups its in-flight entertainment offering. All to come on this week's Mags on Media. We're going to start with this, and a very warm welcome to you. Now, the South African Human Rights Commission has condemned racial remarks made by KwaZulu-Natal businessman who called President Cyril Ramaphosa the K-word. In a video that went viral, Kessie Nair says the president has defrauded the country, blaming him for crime, violence and poor health care. Nair's brother, Krishnan Nair, said he was suffering from a chronic illness, adding that the visuals he posted of himself showed that he lacked the intelligence and understanding of what he was saying. His previous incarceration also playing a role in his personality, claimed the family, and also saying that he was physically and mentally unwell. Now, the issue has caused some debate on how the media reports issues of mental illness. So let's get to that. We're joined by Professor Glenda Daniels, Associate Professor Media Studies at Wits University, along with Cassie Chambers, Operations Director at the SA Depression and Anxiety Group, and William Bird, Director of Media Monitoring Africa. To all of you, a very warm welcome. Cassie Chambers, to you first of all, mental illness. It's an all-encompassing phrase. Is there a test that we in the media should be applying when we're reporting it?
I think it's very important for the media because they are a conduit for us to get information out to the public. We don't want to be painting mental illness as people that are crazy or dangerous. I think it's to realize that it is a real illness that needs real treatment, but being very educated, knowing what mental illness is, can make a difference in how you report it and how sensitively to report it. Mental illness shouldn't be used as an excuse and a headline to make something sound better. This is a real condition that's having a drastic effect on the individual.
Glenda Daniels, as far as the Nair case was concerned, did the media rush to reporting this?
I don't think the media rushed to report it at all. The media reported it exactly as it should have reported it. It called him out as a racist, and it also, parallel to that, also said he's got a mental illness. But the media is not saying because he's got a mental illness, he used the K-word. There's no excuse in society. In fact, I might say all racists are mad, you know, including Donald Trump. But there's no excuse in society, whatever, to be a racist. So there's some kind of way in which we need to be dealing with it. And one of the ways we are dealing with it, actually, is to be calling from social media. It goes on to mainstream. This never happened before, so there's some value to social media that the minute this starts to happen, it's like the guy in Greece on the beach.
But bigotry doesn't necessarily equate to mental illness.
No, not at all. No, there are loads of people who are not bigots and who are mentally ill. And what is mental illness? There are so many different categories of it. There's depression, there's bipolar, there's schizophrenia. There's a wide range of it. So we can't just, in one blanket term, saying so-and-so is mentally ill, therefore. You know, we need to know more detail.
Well, that's exactly the point, William Bird, is that the family said that he was mentally ill. As I said to Cassie Chambers a little earlier, it's an all-encompassing phrase. Yep. We don't know what the mental illness is. So is that any excuse?
No, but it's like one of those things. It's used as a mitigating circumstance by people whose interests it serves at the time. So you'll find that when we report gender-based violence, the mitigating circumstance is, well, you know, she had been cheating on me, so I thought it was okay to beat her. And it's the same kind of idea in this instance where they're saying, okay, he may have said some racist things, but, you know, bear in mind that he's actually not intelligent or mentally ill. And I think that the conflation of those two things is quite interesting.
But is it fair to equate mental illness to gender-based violence?
Well, it's fair to talk of, yes, it is, to the extent that you're talking about dealing with a range of issues that have complex factors causes and outcomes, I think that you can talk about them in that kind of way. I mean, I use it there as an example of saying, here we're seeing mental illness used as a mitigating factor for someone being a racist, and that is just not appropriate. What we should be saying is how do we report on mental illness, and how should we be reporting on it? When we talk about reporting on suicide, for example, there's certain things that the media do repeatedly there where we know that it doesn't often help.
So let's talk about how to report it. Let me go to eNCA's editorial code of conduct. And here's one line which is under the section minimizing harm, William Bird. It says, it's important that our visuals do not erode the dignity of people being filmed, particularly the vulnerable, which, as you've just said, would incorporate the mentally ill. Is that sufficient in terms of an editorial code, or do newsrooms themselves need to revisit the way in which we do it?
Well, it varies, of course, but generally there are particular things that we don't do well as reporting on, particularly suicide, for example. We should be talking about it as someone choosing to end their life as opposed to committing suicide, because then it sounds as though it's a crime. And the way that we reveal particular information in there, you have to bear in mind that you're dealing with a family that's devastated by whatever has occurred, and we need to be sensitive to that. So it's not just about the visuals of showing the family in trauma and wailing away, which is something that they still tend to do, but it's about understanding, what leads to a person taking.
All right, Kessie Chambers, you're listening to this.
Yes.
Are they getting it right? Do they have an understanding of the complexities of this issue?
And I think this is through us creating more awareness.
Are you satisfied with the strategy?
I think yes, and it gives us also an opportunity to say that we need to do more.
In what respect, though?
In the regard with all of us, and through the press and media, we're able to create awareness and talk about these mental health issues, but we need to do it in the correct way. So exactly what you said about suicide being a sensitive topic, it's very complex, and often that will make a headline will be a good headline, or posting a suicide note or a photo of the person or sharing details of how that person ended their life is not as important as the fact that they did die by suicide. And it's the things that we're, even as an organization, are trying to change the words that we use when we talk about things like committing suicide or died by suicide or mental illness. The picture that we have in society of a mental illness is someone sitting in a corner in a straitjacket. And unfortunately, when you're Googling pictures, and even journalists, when you're looking for things instead of interviewing face-to-face a picture of a family, the photos are not indicative of what a mental illness is. So I think we're having to make sure and to check that we are being more sensitive and not just using the go-to pictures and face of what people perceive mental illness to be.
Glenda Daniels, let's for argument's sake assume that Kessie Nair is diagnosed officially with a mental illness, and at this point we don't know what that is, and possibly things would have been easier had the family disclosed what that is. Should we know that? Should that emerge officially in open court? Would that then change the way in which we should be and should have reported that particular issue?
Absolutely.
In what way?
In my view, for many decades, there's been a stigma attached to mental illness in the same way, that HIV/AIDS was stigmatized. Nobody spoke about it. Nobody said so-and-so died of HIV/AIDS and complications due to HIV/AIDS. And I think what's happening very recently in society is mental illness is becoming destigmatized. And I'm saying this through almost empirical evidence from teaching. I have a class of 500 first years, and I say to them, is there more mental illness today? Because all the notes that are coming to me for extensions are about, here's my letter from my psychiatrist, here's my letter from my psychologist, I'm suffering depression. I always give the extensions, I don't question anybody. And then so I ask in an open class, I say, is there more mental illness? And people get very angry with me. Absolutely not. There's more awareness of it today, and thank goodness they're very assertive about it. Thank goodness we're talking about it.
And that's a good thing.
Yes.
But William Bird, there's a degree of expediency then surely attached to all of that. It's a catch-all, is that if you want to justify a comment like a Kessie Nair has made, put up your hand, or the family puts up their hand and say, he's mentally ill, I'm mentally ill. Is it an excuse?
Well, yeah, then it becomes a legitimate one. And if you don't have sufficient understanding to say, well, actually, that isn't an excuse, then it may very well serve as an effective one. Again, precisely because it's a catch-all. So we could easily say, well, Donald Trump does that because he's mentally ill. And to a degree, depending on what is actually wrong with the guy, there may be some elements in which he speaks his mind before thinking a lot more clearly about certain things, which may be indicative of certain elements of a mental illness, for example. But to say that he is like that because he's mentally ill would also be wholly inappropriate.
This, Kessie, I'll get to you now. Would this entire story have been different? Would we not be discussing it had the pivot point in this whole narrative been the president?
No, I don't think so. Honestly, I don't think so. I think because we've had estate agents saying miserable, racist things. We've had somebody who's on a Greek holiday saying these things. People are calling it out, which is fantastic. I mean, you know, it's been done before. It's been done at little dinner parties and little braai places where certain races get together and they think they can denigrate other races. But because they're going on social media and saying these things, we are, including Helen Zille and her colonialism tweets, for instance, can be even put in the same category. And I think it's fantastic that these things are coming out, being called out, and that we can actually explain to people.
So from a media perspective,
from the media perspective,
had we known officially that Kessie Nair had been mentally ill, would that have made any difference to how we reported it? Should we not have reported it at all? William, you pick that one up.
No, I mean, I think that you must, and using it as an excuse for
even
racism,
though that person is possibly not in control of their facilities.
Well, if they aren't,
back to editorial codes of conduct,
if
dignity is infringed.
If they aren't, then clearly that would be a far more problematic thing. If this is a person who has been shown to be, you know, for whatever reasons, speaking things and saying things that ordinarily they may not choose to do, then I think that you would need to think about it. But again, this is, with social media, very often you don't think about those things and they get spread faster than the media are able to pick them up. So it is one of those things that
and we haven't had a chance to get into the social media dynamic of all of this. Kessie Chambers from SADC, I'm going to give you the last word. At the beginning of our conversation, you made a plea to the media saying perhaps we need to understand the notion of mental illness better. What would you have us do?
I think what's so important, and a typical case like the Kessie Nair one, is here we've got where mental illness is being associated. Would we have reported differently, or would we have used mental illness as an excuse if he had diabetes? Would that even have made the headlines? Again, we also have to be very careful by making this association. Racism is not a mental illness. It's completely separate. By making that association, you're also assuming that people with a mental illness are more likely to be racist. And I think that creates a lot of stigma. So we're having to address that by separating the two. It has an influence because it could suggest that maybe he's untreated and he's undiagnosed, therefore he needs treatment. No person with a depression or anxiety is going to have this attitude because of their mental illness. So I think it's to be careful not to use mental illness as an excuse, to understand that it is a real illness. And if something like this, where a family is used, and we've often seen the Oscar Pistorius case where they use mental illness as an excuse. Anxiety is not an excuse for violence. It's not an excuse for aggression. So I think it's to have to understand what is a mental illness, what is things like depression or anxiety, and not just use a blanket term as has a mental illness. That could be things like PTSD, it could be OCD. So I think being specific is important with the family's permission, but also then highlighting if he is saying things like this and going on social media and not having rational thought, then it shows that he's undiagnosed or untreated. And that should be the concern, not that mental illness leads to racism.
To all three of you, I thank you for joining me today. A very interesting and stimulating debate. Professor Glenda Daniels from Wits University, Kessie Chambers from SADC, and William Bird from Media Monitoring Africa. If you'd like to weigh in on the way in which the media reports on mental illness, please visit our various social media pages. And coming up on the programme, we're going to take a close look at an award-winning virtual reality concept helping industrial workers overcome their fear of heights.